Okay, so I love Until Dawn. And I have to elaborate on that a bit because although this is a video about the Dark Pictures, Until Dawn is a pretty important part to the discussion why the Dark Picture is what the Dark Picture is. Until Dawn presents itself as somewhat of a corny slasher horror, with the guy in a mask and a machete hunting down stereotypical teenagers. You know, the likes of those cheap 80s slashers or the early 2000 PG-13 horror movies. But then, halfway through, it suddenly becomes a supernatural story with the appearance of Wendigos, a mythical creature that was rather rarely used in horror at that time. So that makes the story unique and also comments on the genre by subverting it. And that is actually Until Dawn's whole identity. It's a genre subversion. And that is a very huge reason why it's also awesome. The game does that in other ways too. When you first meet a character, you get an introduction describing them in the most unhelpful way possible, just showing 3 one-word descriptions, which does nothing but to further invoke the image of the typical two-dimensional character in horror movies who exists solely to be cannon fodder. And Until Dawn revokes this initial impression. For some of its characters, Mike is a character that starts off somewhat of a sleazy douchebag. You know, the one that would typically be one of the first ones to be killed off. But as soon as shit gets real, he becomes really heroic and selfless even. On the other side of the spectrum you have Ashley, who starts off as a cute geeky girl and making all the quote-unquote good decisions. Her character stays pretty unharmed until the end. However, if you choose to make the worst decisions possible, she automatically becomes the most horrible of the bunch, maliciously causing Chris's death and Emily's, and that all without a care in the world. Ashley. I know Emily is the one you're supposed to hate, easily recognizable by the fact that she's the character you can kill off the most, but I actually like Emily quite a bit. Yeah, she's bitchy all the time, but I don't care. I have reasons why I like her, and just because I can, I will tell you these reasons in Love Letter to Emily. First of all, she probably says the smartest thing anyone says in this game, like how they probably should return and investigate the quote-unquote murder scene of Josh. Yeah, that would have been a good idea. Would have saved you a lot of trouble. Not that caused by the Wendigos, but you wouldn't have made yourself into easy prey. And you would have figured out Josh's plan immediately. Second, this scene. Can I see it again? Fuck Ashley. Third, at least in the ending that I have seen where everyone survives, you get an end scene where everyone is questioned by the police before getting medically treated. Seriously, why is this even a trope? I don't get it. And everyone else is speaking in a very subdued voice, being completely traumatized by this night's events. And then you have Emily rampantly bitching about how useless and cruel her ex-boyfriend and her soon-to-be ex-boyfriend were with her. I love it. Guess she's single again. Fanfiction writers seem to favor coupling her with Jessica, which would be the couple from actual hell. But whatever, let your ship sail to your heart's content. So that was Until Dawn. Very solid game. Arguably, its only real weak spot being the dialogue sometimes. It's not insultingly bad, but it's that kind of dialogue where you get the feeling that the writers weren't quite comfortable with writing young people. I'm sure every one of you has an idea what that looks like. Now that we've established its brilliant forerunner, let's actually talk about the Dark Pictures series and its flaws. Before doing a deep dive into the games themselves, I want to talk about a set of mistakes all of them have, which I like to categorize under because Until Dawn did it. There are elements that were implemented the same or a similar way, which worked well in Until Dawn but fall completely flat in the Dark Picture. The first are the character introductions I talked about earlier. In Until Dawn, they worked well with the theme of deconstructing horror genre tropes, but doing them in earnest is a terrible idea. And neither Dark Picture game works with genre subversion in that way, so it makes no sense to replicate it. If you're not using a cheap trope to subvert it, you're just using a cheap trope. Another one is the use of visions. As a gameplay element, it's fine, but narratively it only really works in Until Dawn. Contrary to Man of Medan or Little Hope, Until Dawn is a supernatural horror story, and its creature, the Wendigo, is a mythical creature from Native American folklore. I don't know how accurate the usage of totems is in this game. I'm not educated well enough in this particular mythology to know that, but visions of the future, to my knowledge, are part of every pagan religion. My point is, at least the items used are important to the mythology the game borrows from and not just pictures and postcards. Last point, but definitely not least in terms of stupidity, is the hiding minigame. So Wendigos can only see clearly when something or someone is moving, which results in a few scenes in Until Dawn where the characters have to stand very still. The player, in turn, has to hold his controller very still to achieve that. I think the idea to actively force you to combat your fight or flight instinct is brilliant. You have to hold still even if the monster is right next to you, which is understandably nerve-wracking. And in the Dark Pictures, you have to press a button to the rhythm of your heartbeat, and if you don't, your heartbeat becomes irregular, which leads to your discovery for some reason. So a suspenseful gameplay element which fit the story turns into Dance Dance Revolution to a heartbeat. And unfortunately, one element that is carried over to the Dark Pictures games is also one that wasn't even great to begin with, which is the dialogue. I think Man of Medan gets it the worst.
I'm thinking you might deserve a promotion. How's Medium Bro sound?
What are you talking about?
You stepped up to the plate. Put yourself right in the line of fire.
You're kind of mixing metaphors there.
Not if the picture's a machine gun.
What is this even supposed to mean? For some reason, whenever characters stand in a group, they don't seem to talk to each other properly. So in Man of Medan, you get these really weird scenes where characters are standing in a circle, just monologuing to each other, and no one reacts to the things the others say. It's so bizarre. But let's actually get into the games themselves, starting off with Man of Medan. I am so bold to claim that no one would argue the notion that Man of Medan is leagues behind Until Dawn in terms of storytelling, though I don't find it to be a complete train wreck either. I would rather describe this game as missed opportunities. The concept of Man of Medan is really not bad at all. I like ghost ships, the open dark sea is always creepy, and the concept of making your character's fears and desires visible by hallucinatory gas or some other means is not hard to make into an entertaining story. We love to see someone's inner demons being explored, and we want to see those demons being overcome. Plus, in a horror story, this personal connection gives the external threats some extra weight, which in turn makes the story more intense. That said, it's actually astonishing that Man of Medan manages to mess up this premise for the most part. And I'm gonna start discussing the character for whom I think this kind of works, which is Conrad. Conrad, my boy. His character for the most part is horn dog and rich douchebag, but mostly horn dog. So when his greatest fear comes to life, the fact that it is a pretty woman chasing him is interesting. I like that she grows older the longer the chase is on, but the meaning that I derive from the scene is that despite all his womanizing behavior, Conrad might be intrinsically afraid of women. And him posing as a philanderer in reality is actually to avoid forming a meaningful connection to a woman, the way he avoids his hallucination. And when he finally has to confront his demon girl, it turns out to be Fliss, his love interest. If you read it like this, it is actually pretty clever, but this is the only scene where you can apply this clever reading to. The way it handles the rest of its character fears is significantly worse. Fliss sees some supernatural imagery because she is afraid of the supernatural, but we were never told why exactly. Does this tell us anything about her upbringing? Does she have personal experience with the supernatural? If you don't connect her inner demons to her personality in a meaningful way, it doesn't have an impact. It's meaningless. Same with Julia, who hallucinates the villain as her fiancé, which would imply that she is maybe kind of afraid of him, which would be an intriguing idea if it ever went somewhere. Speaking of him, Alex is not worth talking about. He just hallucinates the double-headed creature he sees in the coffin, which, fun fact, he still sees even if he never opens the coffin. Another element that hinders the story more than enhances it is the pirate. I know removing them would result in the need to heavily restructure the plot, but I stand by it. The pirates cause some problems. The game wants you to learn that monsters you encounter are actually real people, and I like that. It feels similar to holding your controller still when you encounter a Wendigo in Until Dawn. However, when there are humans around you that want to kill you, this realization does nothing for you unless you have a method of knowing which person stands before you. Another problem is that as soon as the pirates appear, they abolish the theme that the game already began to establish. Fliss tells the other characters to respect the dead and their resting place, but they are somewhat dismissive of that. They are bored witch kids who are excited by the prospect of finding a treasure in the Manchurian gold. This could have been a story about greed and ignorance digging your own grave. It's a theme that is established but promptly forgotten as soon as the pirates enter the picture, because they are forced to enter the Man of Medan by the pirates now, who are the ones who are after the gold. In spite of all of that, I'm still fond of Man of Medan, not as sincerely as I liked Until Dawn, but in a more campy way, like those early 2000s movies I talked about. And I don't mean that in a bad way. A certain campiness can give a medium some charm and make it more enjoyable. However, when Little Hope came out, there was no charm or enjoyment to be found. When the trailer hit after Man of Medan, I was looking forward to it, because it promised me witches, and like witches. But Little Hope didn't deliver. The game is actually about a guy who lost his family in a fire and years later hallucinates them and himself as university colleagues and also as monsters hunting him and them. I hope you knew beforehand, because I think this summary might sound deeply confusing otherwise. Anyway, you might realize that I failed to mention witches. That is because the witches are alive. It's not about witches in any way, shape or form. Yes, the witches are part of the hallucinations, but you could cut those whole out and it wouldn't change anything. So let's begin with the red herring witches. The witch hallucinations are front and center, but they don't have a reason to be in the story at all. The only relation witches have to the actual plot is the town Little Hope's close proximity to Salem. That's it. And that wouldn't be such a huge problem if the witch thing is tied to the story thematically, but it doesn't even make sense figuratively, because the story is not about a witch hunt, it's about Survivor's Guild. And if the writers tried to insert a witch hunt plot in there, they did a bad job with it. So Megan, Anthony's little adoptive sister, set the house on fire specifically with the intention to kill her family. So she did it. She's not accused of anything she didn't do. And even in the witchy hallucinations, she wrongly accused the village people, and gets them killed. The fact that she was manipulated by an authority figure doesn't change that. And even if you disagree with that and are convinced that the priest is the real bad guy and Megan is in reality innocent, this game still doesn't portray a witch hunt. We never learn if Megan's reputation is tarnished by the fact that she set the house on fire. In fact, it is rather hinted at in the beginning that Anthony might be the one wrongly accused of that crime. But then nothing comes of it. Long story short, the witch hunt is only there to make us believe that the story is more interesting than it actually is. So, talking about plot holes is a tricky thing. If you really look for it, you can find at least contrivances in any story. How much you are bothered by each and every one of them is an extremely personal matter. I, for once, am fine with Until Dawn's contrivances. Yes, of course, Josh's traps all work perfectly, and sure, he only targets people who have fuck all to do with the prank on Hannah, except for Ashley, because fuck Ashley. And I also was fine with Men of Medan contrivances. Sure, the ship's electricity worked 70 years and suddenly it doesn't anymore. And oh really, no one ever found the helicopter and the ship until some random dude tried it. Okay. But I'm not giving a plot the same leeway if it corrodes the very foundation it stands on. And if you really think about Little Hope's plot, you realize that nothing makes sense. So in the beginning of Little Hope, a policeman is talking to Anthony, who already hallucinates his passengers, and he just lets him drive on. You're not even testing if he's intoxicated? Yeah, sure. You come across a person who's clearly delusional and you just let him drive on. Yeah, I mean, what could possibly go wrong? Except causing an accident, which he promptly does because of said hallucinations. Best policeman ever. 10 out of 10. Good communication. Then Anthony imagines his family as completely different people. And not that I want to tell anyone how they're supposed to hallucinate, but why is he shipping his adoptive sister with his adoptive brother? Tanya has a boyfriend, so she's not interested in Dennis, and Dennis made some offhand remark that he didn't like her boyfriend Vince, but if that was supposed to be an indication, it was an indication that Anthony, whose hallucinations is this couple, didn't seem to pick up on. So I don't know. On the subject of Vince, their interactions are so strange. First of all, why is he staying in a ghost town? Even the first time around, I found it to be very weird that Anthony repeated everything James said to Vince in their first encounter. Of course, in hindsight, that was necessary because the reality would have been him standing in utter silence, waiting for an answer to a question he never asked. Just the ultimate awkwardness. Also, what does he do when the scenes are playing out where he himself isn't present for? Does he just stay there and wait for them to be over? How does he justify to himself the fact that he knows exactly what was going on without him? But the worst thing is that the message the writers were going for is completely devoid of internal logic. So the whole ordeal with the monsters and overcoming them is to combat Antony's survivor's guilt, right? So in order to save your imaginary family from their monsters, you have to make the right choices in order to eradicate all their bad behaviors. But I have to ask, how is this helping? It's not like being a better person would have saved them from the fire or made Antony more capable of helping them. Maybe Megan wouldn't have been so unhappy living with them and wouldn't have started the fire in the first place. But game! You told me she was manipulated into doing that no matter what, so make up your mind. And even if there was a direct causality between the Clarks' behavior and Megan killing them, it's not like Antony personally was responsible for fixing all their bad behavior. And it's not like retroactively fixing imaginary standards for his family does anything against his guilt. He has survivor's guilt. He's conflicted about his own shortcomings. That is how, guilt works. Ultimately, the objective you're facing by turning hallucinations good is completely detached from the plot they were going for. As much as the witch plot is detached from it too. It's just an incoherent muddle. I feel kind of bad for the animators because the monsters looked cool and they were scary at times. I wish they had better writing around them. So in conclusion, if House of Ashes manages to be even worse than Little Hope, I would be highly fascinated. Or that's what I would have said, because my original script ended there. But then I realized that House of Ashes was already out. So I gave it a watch, and now I can answer this question with a resounding, I don't know. It is definitely not as bad as Little Hope. That is still a low point to this day. And looking at certain aspects, it might even have the high ground on Man of Medan. Because in many small respects, House of Ashes does things better, or at least differently, than its predecessors. While I enjoy stupid rich kids on a boat more personally, it's still a nice change to have protagonists who are actually qualified to be in those extreme situations they are about to encounter. Little movies you see when you read certain documents are a nice addition to sweeten the massive amount of reading you would have to do previously. And in terms of presentation, it seems like they took a page out of Until Dawn again and set the stage in dark underground tunnels and let us see only ever a glimpse of the monster until it finally fully appears. Also, the use of Sumerian culture and mythology is pretty unique in the horror genre as far as I know. And they don't even have the extensive jump scares anymore. However, the game is still lesser than the sum of its parts. As a whole, I found it to be mostly boring. So in that sense, at least for me, House of Ashes was actually a worse experience than Little Hope, because while the latter was supremely stupid and enraging, at least it wasn't boring. But I have to emphasize that this sentiment is highly subjective, more than usual. If you like horror action, you might be fine with 6 hours of non-stop shootouts, people, shooting monsters, and occasionally people again. I am not at all surprised when people are saying that they enjoyed House of Ashes more than the previous games. It pretty much comes down to personal preference with this one. But there are also flaws that came back from the previous installments to haunt us. Because the Dark Pictures did it. Tears gone, I have beer now. Oh, hello dialogue, you're back. And I have to revise my former suspicion that the writers were uncomfortable writing for young people, because I think now that it's more likely that they just take the basic stereotype of a person and crank it up to a level. So here in House of Ashes, because the protagonists are soldiers and therefore has to be the most macho of machos, whoever machoed, they spent the first part of the story constantly making sex jokes and savagely defying their superiors. Because the military is known for their laid-back attitude towards defiance against superiors. Another thing that comes back is, seriously, where is your theme? I've covered already where the writers failed their themes in the previous installments. Here they make a pretty clear narrative of learning to find humanity and trust in a former opponent. You know, war. What is it good for? Which is not original exactly, but it's also not a bad theme. The best the game gets is when Celine and Jason are talking, when the game actually follows up on its own theme. But again, as in the previous games, it doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't tie into the main story at all. It's not a Game of Thrones narrative where humans are so caught up in fighting that they let themselves be overrun by a fantastical and powerful entity. In House of Ashes, they manage to destroy as many monsters as they do, regardless if they team up with Celine or not. We learn that the monsters were discovered by an archaeological team. And because of the hubris and power hungriness, is it a word? Of one woman, basically the whole team gets killed. It's also not a bad theme, but it's not this story's theme. It's the mummies. And since this is not yet enough, we get a third. At the climax, our heroes climb into a hollow earth and learn that the monsters they encountered are actually aliens who have been living there for centuries. I have to correct myself from earlier. They didn't use the mythology of the Sumerians, but the one of the tinfoil hat people. They also find out that the aliens at one point were sentient and intelligent beings, until they caught the vampire virus and became evil. So it was mere bad luck, not as a result of fighting with each other, which would have fit into the original theme. They didn't underestimate the humans or their world, which would have played into the second theme. It's just the thing that happens at the end of War of the Worlds. It's okay to borrow from other stories, but at some point you have to understand your own. And this is where the script finally ended. And then the Quarry came out. The Quarry. I can never catch a break. I thought about making a separate video about the Quarry because this game is not technically a dark picture entry, but it's fine, because I actually don't have terribly much to say about it. It's basically Until Dawn 2.0, even more so than the Dark Pictures were Until Dawn 2.0, with technical improvements for the first half. The second half is the worst in terms of storytelling any of those games got. Except Little Hope. Fuck Little Hope. And when I say technical improvements, I don't mean graphics. I mean the technique of writing, because the dialogue is hands down the best until now. The characters still talk like the stereotypes they are, but for the first time it felt like they were saying things that stereotypes would actually say to each other.
Or maybe there are super ghosts. That's... what? Ghosts, but like 16-bit. Yeah, I don't know what you're saying. Super ghosts.
Otherwise, it follows Until Dawn's formula to a T. Teenagers isolated in the middle of nature, people with machetes, skinny monsters who were once human, it's all there. They even have the same archetypes. Stupid jock, his prissy blonde kind of girlfriend, bitchy Asian girl, shy nerd girl. I had almost an initial hatred for Abby, and there's really no good reason for it except that she's this universe's Ashley. And fuck Ashley. The jokester. Okay, that's not quite fair. While I have nothing against Chris, Dylan is way too good of a character for this game. He's chef's kiss of a character, 10 out of 10. Which is why the frustration is up to 11 when his character arc is abandoned in the second half. I guess I should come to that now. So, initially, it is kind of cool to learn that the story with Laura and Max from the beginning continues, but the flashback goes on for way too long. It distracts from the main story. And later, when Laura joins the group, she completely takes over the narrative. Nothing that happened before matters anymore. It's all set up that gets no payoff. Jacob and Emma's complicated relationship? Not resolved. Jacob being responsible for trapping them all in a werewolf-infested forest never has a follow-up. Abby's and Nick's budding romance, his assolification via werewolf venom, and her subsequently shooting him, which would have been a great narrative to resolve. They don't even talk to each other anymore. Dylan and Ryan's budding relationship. I presume you get what I want to say. As soon as Laura arrives, it's suddenly all about her relationship with the sheriff, and on that note, who cares, and her relationship with Ryan. Dylan makes a remark suggesting that they might have a thing for each other. I don't know how accurate this is supposed to be, but if it is, that's weird. Their antagonism towards each other means they are in love, I guess. And yes, Until Dawn had a similar story shift, but there the characters were still allowed to continue their own arcs. It's not like as soon as Flamethrower Guy shows up, we instead follow him fighting Wendigos. I know I didn't even talk about the Quarry's main story yet, but honestly I really don't want to. I'm too fed up with this game. It's one thing to abandon your overall theme, but the Quarry abandons almost every arc it ever sets up. And if you can't even finish most of your characters' arcs, what are you even doing here? So in conclusion, if another one of those games pops up during production, I don't care, I'm finished. So that makes the story quite... So Wendicoast, the way it handles the West... I have to wait for my washing machine to quiet. But, oh hello.